Hi, my name is Mark Liebman. I'm a retired Navy captain and naval aviator, and I'm also an author. I've written 12 novels, 3 of which are Age of Sail, and this presentation is about the naval lessons from the American Revolution. So this series and this presentation all has its genesis in a conversation I had with my publisher when he asked me, I know you are a fan of Hornblower and the other novels of that genre. Are you interested in writing one? So it took me a few nanoseconds to say yes, and I then started to think about it and try to come up with an idea that was different. So what I came up with was a story that just didn't focus on just the Royal Navy, but actually focused on the Continental Navy and the Royal Navy. And so what I settled on was 2 characters, one from each service. So it made them a little bit different. But what I didn't realize when I started down this path was the amount of research I would have to do to actually create the novels. So right now I'm under contract for 6. There'll probably be 7 or 8 in the series. 3 are out. You can see here Death of the Lady, which when it first came out was an Amazon bestseller. Carronade came out about a year later. Death of the Lady is a 3rd one, and it's out. It came out this past fall, and I'm working on the next one, which is called Last Battles. So anyway, the difficulty in doing books on this series is that you have to transport yourself back into the 1700s when there is no electricity, there's no internet, there's no telephone. There are roads, the roads that they have are not, let's put it this way, the interstates or even the improved roads that we have throughout our highway system, and you can't walk down the street to go to the local grocery store to go buy groceries. So what resulted in this was a blog on the things I learned doing the research. I now write a blog every Sunday morning on stuff from that period, roughly 1775 to 1816, that you don't read about in history books. As of the day we're recording this, which is June 23rd, 2023, there are 216 posts, and you can see on this slide where they all appear. A lot of people read them because I know that they send me emails asking me questions. So let's get into this. So the story about the naval lessons of the American Revolution really begins about 700 years ago, or 700 years before the American Revolution, in 1066, when France invades England. And from that point on until 1775, the 2 countries were at war for 116 years. Now that doesn't sound like a lot because it's only about a little over 10%, but when you look at the number of wars, they just went on and on and on, and it seemed like every time you turn around, or every generation or 2, they were fighting each other and killing each other. So then you add in the American Revolution and the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars. England and France were at war between 1775 or 1778, when France joins the American Revolution, and 1815 for another 28 years. That's 54% of the time they were at war during those 52 years. It's an amazing thing, and strangely enough, a lot of that animosity still holds today, but that's a different scope and a different topic. So the 7 Years' War was really the first truly global war, and the English were by far and away the clear winner. The war was fought on Europe, North and South America, on the Indian subcontinent, Africa, and Asia. And the combatants were these German states, France and Spain, the Holy Roman Emperor, Russia, and a few other countries against the English. And it was a pretty bloody affair. If you look in the statistics here, each country lost lots and lots of people. A whole generation essentially was killed off. And they needed 5 separate treaties to end the war. But in the treaties, England is the clear winner because it gains possessions, and France not only loses its possessions in North America, but it loses a lot of its Caribbean possessions, and Spain receives Louisiana and all the French territory west of the Mississippi River, and Britain gets what we now call Florida. So there's a lot of land that was swapped, and the French were not happy because they essentially lost all their possessions in North America. So in 1775, the American Revolution begins, and it really became 2 things. One, the second truly global war, because you had the 13 colonies allied with France, the Dutch Republic, and an Indian republic known as Mysore, fighting England and the 7 German states, and you can see them listed here. So combat took place in North and South America, as well as Central America, India, Europe, and Africa, and the Caribbean. And hundreds of thousands of people died from combat and also from disease. The U.S. population, I shouldn't say that, the population of the 13 colonies was about 2.5 million, of which about 460,000 were slaves, and of the 460,000, about 10% or 46,000 were considered freed slaves, and about 5,000 to 7,000 participated in the American Revolution in either the Continental Army or the Continental Navy. But of that 2.5 million, 158,000 people died, that's civilians and military, from disease and from other causes. In naval terms, it was a pretty bloody war. And you can see here the list of the ships that got lost. So the Royal Navy was hurt, but it was much bigger than the French Navy, which also was hurt, lost a bunch of ships. And the Continental Navy was born during the war, but it also died during the war. And I'll explain that in a little bit. And the other thing that I want to talk about is the American Revolution on this continent in North America turned into not only a revolution against the English, but because it pitted brothers against brothers, fathers against sons, mothers against sons and daughters in terms of loyalist versus rebel, it actually became somewhat of a civil war as well. So at the start of the American Revolution, the Royal Navy had roughly 350 rated ships. Now you can see on this chart what a rated ship is. A 6th rater is a frigate with 20 to 28 guns, and it goes all the way up to a 1st rater, which is a ship of the line, has 3 gun decks and 100 to 120 guns. The Continental Navy didn't exist when the war started, and then when it was created in 1776, it had no ships. So you cannot confuse the Continental Navy with the modern United States Navy, and let me explain why. So the Continental Navy was created by the Continental Congress on October 13th, 1775, and then at the end of the war in 1783, it was dissolved. It was no more. It was also dissolved with the Continental Army. So the Continental Army and the Continental Navy were in existence only during the American Revolution. And the modern United States Navy was born 11 years after the peace treaty on March 27th, 1794. So the other interesting fact here is that the term United States America was first used in the Articles of Confederation. And you theoretically cannot use the term United States ship until after the date that the Continental Congress and the 13 colonies ratified the Articles of Confederation, which is March 1st, 1781, and by which time the war had been going on for a better part of 6 years. And you can see the two flags, the Grand Union flag, which has the essentially the British ensign in red and white stripes, and that morphed into what we call the U.S. ensign, which has the stars and bars. So the Continental Navy is now born. The Congress has passed resolutions. They passed laws saying that we're now going to authorize building ships, and the fastest way to get ships now was by modifying existing merchant ships. And merchant ships in that era, just like they are today, are not built like warships. So the first group of ships built for the Continental Navy were actually merchant ships converted to frigates and sloops, or armed frigates, sloops, and brigs, and stuff like that, ships like that. The Continental Navy is now authorized, but to find the money, the Congress had to go out and literally borrow it from individuals and from companies, and also get it from fees from privateers that have taken ships from the British. And the reason for that is the Continental Congress did not have the power to levy taxes. So again, it authorizes 13 frigates. You can see the list that are built. They're essentially 5th and 6th raters. They're based on British designs, and the advantage we had over the British was the fact that we had lots and lots of wood, high quality oak and pine, which we could use to build these ships, which, by the way, before the Revolution, we were exporting to the UK to use in their shipbuilding program. And these ships were actually based on British designs because many of the US shipyards at the time were beginning to have discussions with the Royal Navy about building ships here in North America for the Royal Navy. So of these ships that they built, only one really survived the war, and that was the frigate Alliance, 36 guns. It survived the war. It had actually a stellar career, and it was sold in 1783 when the Continental Congress decided to dissolve the Navy. When you look at the numbers, the phrase I have up here is we lost our ass to the Royal Navy. But the results show that the Continental Navy and actually the privateers, and I'll talk about them in a few seconds, really hurt the Royal Navy bad. So the Continental Navy, over the course of the Revolution, authorized and paid for 63 ships. One of which was a ship of the line, 76 guns. It was called America. We gave it to the French as a way of paying our debt. And we being the Continental Congress, as well as many of the individual colonies, issued things called letters of marque. And again, I'll talk about privateers in a second. But the privateers really had a significant impact. They captured between 12 and 15%, depending on whose estimate you want to believe, of the Royal Merchant Fleet. So what it did was it hampered the Royal Navy's ability to move people and supplies around the world, particularly to North America. Because again, to go from England to North America in that day and age was essentially 4 to 6 weeks if you made a fast transit. So the French Navy presence in the Chesapeake in 1781 was a significant action in the fact that it now prevented the Royal Navy from evacuating Cornwallis and his army from Yorktown, and it led to a surrender. But it did not end the war. The war continued on for another 2 years. The peace treaty was not signed until September 3rd, 1783, and Yorktown surrender was in mid-October 1781. So let's talk about privateers. So there's a saying that says, scratch a patriot, you'll find a businessman. Well, in March 23rd, 1776, the Continental Congress passed an act authorizing the Congress, or enabling the Congress, to issue letters of marque. And a letter of marque essentially is giving someone, a consortium or owner of a ship, the opportunity to arm it and go seize other ships from your enemy and then sell them in what's known as admiralty courts. So you seize a ship, you take it to an admiralty court, you get money for the ship and you get money for the cargo or the assets on board the ship, like the cannons if it's a warship. So the Congress's law set standards of conduct. It required these consortiums to post bonds, and also it said guidelines on prize money, the most important of which is how much the Continental Congress would get if you took a prize. So not only did the Continental Congress issue roughly 1,700 letters of marque, but but almost every one of those 13 colonies issued letters of marque, and the number varies between 942 and 1,151. So essentially there's almost 2,700 letters of marque issued, and over the course of the 8 years of the war, they captured 3,087 Royal Navy or British East India merchant ships. So that those captures really hurt the British efforts in North America, and then also the prize money that they generated and the fees that the Continental Congress collected helped fund the American Revolution. So lesson one, we're a maritime nation. It doesn't take a rocket scientist, but if you look at the map of the United States, you see in the north we're bordered by the Great Lakes, the west, the Pacific, the east, the Atlantic, the south, the Gulf of Mexico. So in the beginning of this country, even when the Continental Congress was running the country and before the American Revolution, traders in the 13 colonies sent their ships literally all over the world. And our primary exports at the time were rice and indigo and lumber. Cotton was not a major export yet. And then salted meats primarily from the farms in the south, and dried fish and fruit from all the other of the colonies. So the population of the 13 colonies was primarily along the coast, and the peace treaty that gave us our independence essentially gave us all the English territory below the Canadian border, which by the way was relatively well undefined, and the Gulf of Mexico east of the Mississippi. So it was a pretty large swath of land, and we had no idea what was out west past the Mississippi, other than the fact that there was an ocean someplace out there called the Pacific. Fast forward to modern times, about 90% of the non-NAFTA, that's the North American Free Trade Agreement, freight that comes into the United States or goes to overseas goes by ship. If you go back to 30 years now to Desert Storm, 95% of all the material that we used to fight or evict the Iraqis from Kuwait went by ship. if you look at the two most critical battles in World War I and World War II, they were the battles of the Atlantic. Because unless we maintain what we call the Atlantic Bridge, the U.S. Army or the Allies would not have been able to take on and defeat Germany. And if you look at the Cold War, it's the same thing. Whatever we had to do during the Cold War, any fight in Europe meant that we would have to win the Battle of the Atlantic. If you look at the Pacific, any fight that we're going to have with the People's Republic of China is going to be dependent on the ability of the United States Navy and our allies to keep the sea lines of communication open and be able to support our forces in the Western Pacific. So, and today, while a lot of the weapons that we're donating to the Ukraine or selling to the Ukraine are coming out of our stocks in Europe, there's a lot of it that comes from the United States. And trust me, you don't put tanks on C-5s and fly them to Europe in any economical way. They have to be large armored vehicles like tanks and armored personnel carriers typically go by ship. So by definition, since we're a maritime nation, lesson 2 is that we need a strong Navy. Now, I mentioned this before, but in 1783, we dissolved the Continental Navy and the Continental Army, which meant until we reauthorized them in 1794, the United States was essentially defenseless. And the rest of the powers in the world knew that. We had no Navy to protect our ships. And even though our merchant ships were going overseas to the Mediterranean, to Europe, to South America, they fell easy prey to pirates, to privateers, well, not so much privateers because we weren't at war, but pirates and those who wanted to do us ill will. So the first place it began to become apparent was when the French Revolution began. The powers that be in the Congress said, hey, wait a second, we made an agreement with the King of France. We now have a French revolutionary government. We're not going to pay you our bill. So the French began seizing our ships. They began authorizing privateers to seize our ships. And lo and behold, in 1794, March 27th, we create what's now known as the United States Navy, and we authorize the construction and manning and equipping ships. And they were used during the Quasi War, which with France in 1798 to 1800, and then against the Barbary pirates. And ever since then, we have had a United States Navy that has been dedicated to protecting our assets around the globe. John Paul Jones gets a lot of press because he is in many ways the inspiration of what we now call the fighting spirit of the United States Navy. And at the time, there was a battle in the Marine Committee between John Hughes and John Adams and Stephen Hopkins about where we should get our captains for our naval vessels. And Hughes was adamant in the fact that he wanted people who were good naval officers, not necessarily merchant seamen, because merchant seamen even are really businessmen and they're not necessarily warriors. They can be, but they are not necessarily warriors. And if you read John Paul Jones's writings, the quote that I have down here is really something that's a summary of it. But essentially, he said, a good naval officer has to be, number 1, a leader. Number 2, he has to be an outstanding seaman. Number 3, he has to be a tactician and strategist. And number 4, he's got to be courageous. And he's got to be able to make the right decisions to accomplish his mission. And then he has a typically John Paul Jones expression. He says everything else beyond that is claptrap. So it's true, people are the key, and the Navy has to be led by people who exhibit those characteristics so that we can have a Navy led by warriors, and to use a derogatory term, not shoe clerks, because history has shown when the shoe clerks are in charge, the Navy doesn't function well, and we get a lot of people killed and in some cases defeated. So the last lesson is that we need to leverage technology and not be slaves to it. And this is becoming truer even today, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So if you look at the ships that we built during the American Revolution, Joshua Humphreys is the first guy who came up with this idea of using these long diagonal cross members from one side of the ship down underneath the hull and up to the other, so you could build a longer ship, a narrower ship, which would then go through the water faster. And then he would taper the stern, which actually increased their speed. He's another one who came up, he's also the one who came up with an idea, what we would now call spaced or layered armor. Essentially what he did was he said, took a layer of hard oak, of which the United States has lots of, soft white pine, and then another layer of hard oak. So what happened is the cannonball would hit the outer layer, the soft oak would compress a minute amount, absorbing the blow, and the cannonball would not penetrate and drop into the water. And that's how the reason why Constitution in the battle against the Guerriere, some sailors said, my God, the ship's sides are made of iron. Well, it's not really true, but what it did do was up to a point, and the Constitution and Constellation, in fact, all these frigates took balls as big as 18 and 24 pounders. They did not penetrate the hull. And the penetration of the hull would cause splintering, and splinters caused most of the casualties when you had ships of this generation fighting. So that was, that's one piece of technology. We had John Erickson, this is the first guy who came up with a practical armored turret, and that was on the Monitor. And then John Dahlgren came up with a rifled naval gun to improve the accuracy, and then different kinds of shells that could be fired out of it, which was become the Dahlgren guns. But I want to come back to what we call the super frigates, and that's Constellation, Chesapeake, Congress, President of the United States. These ships were an ugly surprise when they met the Royal Navy for the first time in the War of 1812. They were faster than the standard Royal Navy frigates, even though the Royal Navy had several that were, a whole class, as a matter of fact, that were 44 guns. What this class of ships mounted was not only 44 guns, but larger in terms of throw weight, and they were more maneuverable. They had the layered armor, and most importantly, they were faster by several knots. So they could pick and choose when they wanted to engage, and if they wanted to run away from a ship of the line, they could. If they wanted to engage a frigate their size or about their size, they could. But the point of all this is that technology is not the be-all and end-all. So today, we have all kinds of interesting technology, but we're going to have to learn how to fight without using it, because in any war with a peer adversary, we can't count on things like GPS, satellite communications, and or access to things like the internet. So we're going to have to go back and doing things the basic way, or the basics, like navigating using celestial sights of the sun or stars. We're going to have to learn how to use paper charts, or at least charts where we actually plot courses on it, and not rely on things that are electronic, that we need access to external sources, external to the ship sources. So the fact of the matter is the Navy has always been a leader in technology and in learning how to use it, but so far we've not become slaves to it. So that's the end of this thing. I hope you found this interesting. If you liked it, subscribe, and I have several other podcasts on different things of history on my YouTube channel. Thank you for listening, and have a good day.